This is going to be the most uncomfortable topic I've talked about since leaving the Amish community 4 years ago. But people keep asking me about it, so I'm finally going to address it. Do Amish old men believe intimacy should change after 60? I'm Sarah. I'm an ex-Amish girl from Pennsylvania, and I'm going to tell you what I actually know about this topic, what I observed growing up, and why this question is way more complicated than you think. First thing you need to understand is that nobody in the Amish community talks about sex. Nobody. Not openly, not in families, not in church, not anywhere. It's one of those topics that's just completely off limits. I grew up in that world, and I can tell you that sex education doesn't exist. You don't learn about it in school. Your parents don't sit you down and have the talk. You just pick things up gradually from living on a farm, from seeing animals, from whispered conversations with other kids your age who are just as confused as you are. So, when I try to answer this question about what older Amish men believe about intimacy after 60, I'm working with limited information because this is not something that's discussed, ever. Old men aren't sitting around at barn raisings talking about their intimate lives. That would be absolutely scandalous. But I can tell you what I observed, what I pieced together, and what the underlying beliefs are that would shape how elderly Amish people approach this topic. The Amish believe that sex is for procreation. That's it. That's the official teaching. Sex exists to make babies. It's a duty within marriage, a blessing from God, but it's tied directly to having children. This comes from the Bible verse about being fruitful and multiplying. Everything in Amish life comes back to the Bible, and when it comes to sexuality, that's the guiding principle. Make babies, grow the community. That's what sex is for. Now, here's where it gets interesting when you apply that belief to people over 60. If sex is for procreation and a woman over 60 can't have babies anymore, what's the point? Does it stop? Is it still acceptable? I never heard anyone actually address this directly, but I watched my grandparents and other elderly couples in the community, and I can tell you what I observed. My grandparents were married for over 60 years when my grandfather died, 63 years to be exact. They lived in the Dottie house, the small addition to my parents' farmhouse, where the elderly parents move when they pass the farm to the next generation. They had their own little space, their own bedroom, their own life separate from the main household but still connected. And what I observed was this. They still had a relationship, they still had their private moments, but it was never discussed. It was never acknowledged. It just existed in this space that nobody talked about. I remember one time when I was about 14, I walked past their bedroom early in the morning and heard them talking softly, laughing together in a way that felt intimate. And I remember feeling shocked, not because there was anything inappropriate happening, but because I'd never thought of elderly people as still having that kind of connection. In my mind, intimacy was for young married couples making babies. The idea that my grandparents, who were in their 70s at the time, still had any kind of intimate relationship was something I'd never considered. But here's what I think happens in Amish marriages as people age. The focus shifts. When you're young and married, there's this pressure to have children. Lots of children. Amish families are huge, and that's by design. The church needs to grow through birth because hardly anyone converts into the Amish. So young couples are having babies constantly. 7, 8, 10 kids is completely normal. And intimacy at that stage of life is very much tied to that procreation purpose. But as women hit menopause and can't have children anymore, that pressure lifts. The official reason for intimacy is gone. But the relationship doesn't end. These couples have been together for decades at that point. They've worked side by side their entire adult lives. They've raised children together. They've built a life together. And I think, though nobody would ever say this out loud, that intimacy continues, but it becomes something different. It becomes about the relationship, about connection, about companionship. The Amish don't divorce. Marriage is for life. It's a vow made before God, not just before another person. When you marry in the Amish church, you're in it forever. There's no way out. So, elderly couples who've been married for 50, 60, 70 years, they're in a lifelong partnership that goes way beyond just making babies. And I think intimacy continues as part of that partnership, even if it's never acknowledged or discussed. But here's where the culture makes this really complicated. Because on one hand, the official teaching is that sex is for procreation. But on the other hand, nobody's actually enforcing that once people reach an age where procreation isn't possible. There's no church rule that says you have to stop being intimate with your spouse after a certain age. There's no bishop checking in on elderly couples to make sure they're following some kind of rule. It's just this unspoken thing that exists in private. I think elderly Amish men, if they thought about it consciously, which I doubt most of them do, would probably say that intimacy is still acceptable within marriage at any age, because marriage is sacred, marriage is a lifelong bond, and what happens within that marriage is between the couple and God. But they would never talk about it. They would never frame it as sex for pleasure, because that's worldly, that's indulgent, that's not the Amish way. They would frame it, if they framed it at all, as part of their duty to their spouse, part of maintaining the marriage relationship. There's also this practical element that I observed. Elderly Amish couples are still physically affectionate in ways that younger couples often aren't. They hold hands, they sit close together, they touch each other's shoulders or backs when they're talking. Because after decades of marriage, after all the physical restrictions of youth have faded, after all the pressure to perform and procreate is gone, what's left is just two people who've spent their entire adult lives together. And that creates a kind of intimacy that's deeper than just physical. My grandmother died when I was 17, and I'll never forget watching my grandfather at her funeral. He was 81 years old. He'd been married to her for 65 years, and the grief on his face wasn't just about losing a companion or a partner in running the household. It was the grief of losing someone he'd been intimate with in every sense of the word for his entire adult life. That intimacy didn't stop at 60. It didn't stop at 70. It lasted until death. Now, there's another side to this that I need to mention because it's part of the reality. Not all elderly Amish marriages are happy. Just like in any culture, there are couples who grow apart, who resent each other, who've spent decades in a marriage that didn't work, but they can't divorce, they're stuck. And in those marriages, I imagine intimacy does stop at some point, because why would it continue if the relationship itself is broken? But again, this is never discussed. These couples just exist in this state of quiet misery, fulfilling their duties, maintaining appearances, but privately disconnected. I also think about the widows and widowers in the community. Amish people often remarry after a spouse dies, even in old age. I knew several men who lost their wives in their 60s and remarried women in their 60s or 70s. And those marriages weren't just practical arrangements for housekeeping and companionship, they were real marriages, which means there was an expectation of intimacy, even at that age. Nobody talks about it, but it's happening, because marriage means intimacy, regardless of age. The thing that struck me most after I left the community and started learning about how the English world talks about sex and relationships is how different the conversation is. In the English world, people talk about sex drives, about desire, about pleasure, about fulfillment. In the Amish world, none of those words exist in the context of sexuality. It's all framed around duty and procreation and marriage responsibilities. But that doesn't mean the feelings don't exist. It just means they're buried under layers of religious teaching and cultural silence. I think elderly Amish men, if you could get them to talk honestly, which you never could, would probably say something like this. Intimacy is part of marriage. It's not something you talk about, but it's there. As you age, your body changes, your needs change, but the relationship continues. And within that lifelong relationship, intimacy has its place, even if it looks different than it did when you were young. But again, this is all speculation on my part because nobody actually discusses this. What I can tell you for certain is that Amish marriages that last 60, 70 years are built on more than just procreation. They're built on partnership, on working together every single day, on raising children and grandchildren together, on building a life side by side. And intimacy in all its forms is woven throughout that partnership. It doesn't stop at 60, it evolves, it changes, but it doesn't end just because babies are no longer a possibility. The Amish don't have the modern concept of sexuality being separate from reproduction. They don't have the language for talking about intimacy as its own thing, valuable in its own right, but they also don't have a rule that says it stops at a certain age. It's just one of those things that continues privately, never acknowledged, never discussed, but understood to be part of the marriage covenant. Looking back now from the outside, I find the silence around this topic both frustrating and sad, because it means generations of people going through life without ever being able to talk openly about something that's such a fundamental part of human relationships. It means elderly couples maintaining intimacy, but never being able to acknowledge it or celebrate it or even discuss it with each other in any meaningful way. It's just this thing that happens in the dark, in private, with no language to describe it. So, do Amish old men believe intimacy should change after 60? I think the honest answer is that most of them probably don't think about it in those terms at all. They don't have a belief system that specifically addresses sexuality in old age. They just continue living their marriages the way they always have, adjusting as their bodies age, maintaining their relationships, fulfilling their marital duties, whatever that means for them at that stage of life. And they do it all in complete silence because that's the Amish way.